Hello, everybody. Welcome to number 2 in this Second Presbyterian Church history lesson. And tonight, our speaker is David Ratterman. David is a friend and neighbor of Elizabeth and mine. And I've gotten to know David through all kinds of work that he's done at the Filson Historical Society.
It is on. You just might come to me a little closer.
That better?
Yes.
All right. Be scared of it. So, his work, and I've heard some of his presentations. I know how good he is. And I think you're really going to enjoy it. You read his biography, but in a nutshell, he is a very distinguished lawyer, retired now from the firm of Stites and Harbison. He is a former president of the University of Kentucky Alumni Association, and he's just won their Alumni Service Award or their Distinguished Alumni Award. His specialty is construction law and specifically steel construction for the steel industry. His topic tonight is Second Presbyterian Church. And
yeah, but I don't know if they've got this set up right.
Who is that person?
You might ask anyone on Zoom to make sure they're muted.
Okay, if you're on Zoom, would you please mute yourself, please? Thank you. So his topic tonight is Second Presbyterian Church and Louisville in the tumult of slavery, the Civil War, and Jim Crow. David?
Nick, is it at all possible to move the screen just a foot or so this way? If not, it's fine. I don't know if it will mess up like some.
Elizabeth, is the screen movable or not?
We tried to move it earlier.
That's
and
fine.
we lost the Wi-Fi connection. So apparently that's which is good news and bad news for me. When I have practiced this talk before at home, I've used my slide clicker and it's been automatic. And here there's a 4-second delay. So it's going to be disjointed, but that's good because you'll know it's, I don't have to be, you'll know it's either the slides or it's the moment on my part, but you won't be able to tell which one it is. Can you hear me okay with the mic? A little bit closer. Okay. All right. I'll do my best on coordinating all this. It's great to be here. It's a real honor to be here with you tonight. I need to start tonight as Patrick Lewis started 2 weeks ago and announced that I am not a Presbyterian, and I was having some great difficulty understanding the difference between the old Presbyterian school and the new school Presbyterian. So I asked my friend Dick Clay if he could help me, and he was kind enough to say, sure, no problem. And he sent me this flow chart with the focus. Tonight, I want to focus on the subject that touches your history, our regional history, and my family history. That is how your faith community and the larger Louisville community and my immigrant great-grandparents and their community survived perhaps the most challenging period in American history. As you will see as we go along, it all blends together. I'm going to start out with my immigrant family history, which I think provides a unique window into what was happening in the larger community. I'm going to initially focus on the year 1867, which was pivotal both in my family history and in Second Church history. I'll explain the lead up to 1867 and then the fallout after 1867. Fair warning, I'm going to deal with some uncomfortable subjects. They just can't be avoided in this story. Let's start with a little family history for context. As they say in the country, my mother's people, German Protestant immigrants, were part of a great American migration in the 1850s. Migration was fed by a failed revolution in the Germanic states in 1848. Both the German peasantry, which included my great-grandparents, and German intellectuals, which did not include my great-grandparents, were seeking some basic human rights: trial by jury, freedom of the press, freedom from the entrenched patriciate of feudal Europe, and freedom of religion. After arriving in America, abolition was added to the list, and for that, as I'll explain later, the German immigrant community paid a price. My great-grandparents met, married, and spent the Civil War living in slave quarters and working alongside enslaved families on a large Oldham County farm. For reference purposes, that farm was part of the same community and nearly adjacent to Hermitage Farm. Two of my great aunts were born in those slave quarters on that land, likely birthed by the same midwives who birthed dozens of enslaved babies during that period. In 1867, the family moved from Oldham County to Jefferson County. They made that move to work as tenant farmers in Jefferson County. 115 years later, in 2022, I discovered that my great-grandparents likely made that move to escape persecution at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was meting out vengeance against both formerly enslaved families and German immigrants who befriended formerly enslaved families. Kentucky enjoyed a unique status after the Civil War. It was bound by neither the Emancipation Proclamation nor a federal Reconstruction government. I've got a note here, Elizabeth, that says your internet connection is unstable, so.
We just need to pray.
We'll keep
silently pray for the technology spirit to feel calm.
Okie dokie, good deal. One historian comments that Kentucky went through a period of readjustment rather than reconstruction. Now, I'd like for you to study this image on the screen. I'm going to go off script here for a minute. This is a political cartoon from that era, and you probably can't read it from there, but across the top, well, first of all, it has someone who has the White League on his hip, shaking hands with somebody in a Ku Klux Klan robe with two guns and a Bowie knife, and as they say in the country, a silly grin on his face. Across the top, it says, "The Union as it was," and then it says, "This is a white man's government," and then it says, "The lost cause worse than slavery." Shows a couple huddling, and on the left, it shows a lynching, and on the right, it shows a schoolhouse being burned down. And from my research, I do not think this is an inaccurate depiction of what was going on at that particular point in time. After the Civil War, Kentucky's legislature and most of its public offices were dominated by prominent former slaveholders known as conservative unionists. Our friend and colleague, Dr. Patrick Lewis, who spoke here 2 weeks ago, has written perhaps the definitive text on the subject. At the outset of the war, the conservative unionists had sworn allegiance to the federal government under the mistaken belief that the federal government would uphold the institution of slavery. When things didn't turn out that way, they felt betrayed and joined forces with their Confederate comrades to seize control of the legislature and contrive a scheme to keep the Black folk and those who befriended Black folk in their place. One member of Congress at that time from Louisville commented, "In the whole Christian world, there remains but 3 slave states, Cuba, Brazil, and Kentucky. Historian and Professor Emeritus Marion B. Lucas of Western Kentucky University writes, Klansmen roamed the countryside, beating blacks and whites who befriended them. Murders and lynchings were commonplace. Kentuckian Robert Penn Warren observed, to a certain number of contemporary citizens, the Civil War seemed to have been fought for the right to lynch without legal interference. Now I'm going to go off script again for just a minute or two and read part of, I'm going to talk about lynching a little bit. I'm going to talk more about it later. But I've got an excerpt here from an article that ran in the Kentucky Humanities magazine in the fall of 2021. And it says, Kentucky was a hotbed of lynching. A person who oftentimes was African-American could be lynched for a number of crimes: the lack of respect of white people, murder, rape of a white woman, flirting with a white woman, not knowing his place in society, or even general mischief. Almost any crime was grounds for a lynching. Whatever the lynchers saw as a crime, the lynchers imposed their own punishment in the form of rough justice. Now, that same article says, and there's some debate over the exact number, but this is correct in order of magnitude. From the period immediately after the Civil War to the early 20th century, there were approximately 189 lynchings in Kentucky. Of that number, 100 were Black people. The other 89 were white people. Now, think a minute about who comprised that other 89 people. I've got another article here from a book written by an elderly Black African-American who talked about the social mandate that his parents gave to him, okay? And what was considered appropriate and what wasn't considered appropriate. And as I think about this, and if I think about what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, about what I heard from my parents and my grandparents, it sort of comes into focus, and it's all based around fear. Okay, here are, you heard the general offenses that could lead to lynching. Here are some specific that don't do. A Black male could not offer his hand to shake hands with a white male because it implied being socially equal. A Black male who offered his hand to a white woman risked being accused of rape. Black and white people were not supposed to eat together. If they did eat together, white people were to be served first, and some sort of partition was to be placed between them. Under no circumstance was a Black male to offer to light a cigarette of a white female. This placed him in danger of being accused of rape. Black people were not allowed to show public affection toward one another, especially kissing, because it offended white people. Jim Crow etiquette prescribed that white people were introduced to, that Black people were introduced to white people, never white people to Black people. White people did not use courtesy titles of respect when referring to Black people. For example, Mr., Mrs., Miss, Sir, or Madam. Instead, use of courtesy titles when referring to white people only, and were not allowed to call them by their first names. White motorists had the right of way at all intersections. And here are some other more personal items. Never assert or even intimate that a white person is lying. Never impute dishonorable intentions to a white person. Never suggest that a white person is from an inferior class. Never lay claim to or overly demonstrate superior knowledge or intelligence. Never curse a white person. Never laugh derisively at a white person. Never comment upon the appearance of a white female. Now, I'm going through all of this now, and I know this is painful and it's a little bit tedious. But at the end of this story, I'm going to talk about how your faith community, in one of the most difficult times in American history, overcame this. Okay, where was I on the script? Let me give you a little bit more. Here we go. Neither your faith community nor my great-grandparents were blind to any of this. It changed the trajectory of my family, and it changed the trajectory of your faith community. More family history to put that in context. For 5 generations, initially as tenants and then as freeholders, my family farmed 3 tracts of land in Jefferson County along the old Brownsboro Turnpike. Those tracts ran roughly from Limekiln Lane on the east to Locust Grove on the west. In 1871, my grandfather was born in a log cabin on one of those tracts. In the early decades of the 20th century, my mother and her 6 siblings were born in a clapboard farmhouse on another of those tracts just east of what is now Holiday Manor Shopping Center. As a child, through the middle decades of the 20th century, I would join my elders under ancient maple trees around the old farmhouse on cool summer nights and hear stories recounting 3 generations of life on the land. When we lost the last member of that generation, I set about compiling those stories for my grandchildren. Digging into our history, I discovered that much of what had been passed down to my generation was either grossly incomplete or had been woven from false threads of something called the myth of the lost cause. I mention this because my great-grandparents had clearly lived a different history than that which was passed down to my generations. For reasons I believe to have been tied to religion and culture and fear, history had been rewritten. Tonight, we're going to explore just how this happened, both in my family and in the larger Louisville community. For example, we know for a fact that one path of the Underground Railroad ran across the land worked by my great-grandparents that led to at least 14 landings on the Ohio River within walking distance of that land. Runaway slaves, slaveholders, and slave patrols would have all crossed the land during the time when my great-grandparents worked it. We know that an adjacent farm, a widower with a harem of 20 to 30 enslaved women begat 3 generations of children, quote, out of his own loins. They were then sold into slavery. Some of those children or their blood kin would have worked the land alongside my great-grandparents. We know that starting in approximately 1863, 206 enslaved men from that farming community enlisted in the Union Army to gain their freedom. We know that most of them needed to escape in order to enlist, and we know that their wives and children left behind paid a severe price in beatings and retribution. We know that on January 25th, 1865, 22 black troopers of the 5th United States Colored Cavalry were ambushed and slaughtered by Confederate guerrillas near Simpsonville in adjacent Shelby County. This while merely driving cattle from Jessamine County to Louisville to feed Louisville. This was not a military operation. They were lightly armed, and the weapons that they did have were obsolete and could not be reloaded quickly. They were slaughtered. We know with a high degree of certainty that some of those troopers were blood kin to enslaved families in Oldham County, and that news of the massacre would have spread across Oldham County like frost on a January morning. We know, let me go off script again here, because 900 head of cattle, a good portion, if not all of those cattle, would have gone to the largest and best run packing company, processing firm in Louisville, which was run by a prominent local Louisville citizen named James McFerrin. Does it name mean anything to you all? It should, okay? James McFerrin, come on now. James McFerrin, at the same time my family was moving into Jefferson County, moving to the tracks I showed you earlier, James McFerrin was purchasing Berry Hill and moving on Limekiln Lane. As you know, James McFerrin was a direct ancestor to some of the members of this church, Charles and Mac Barr. This demonstrates to me the fact that this all fits together, that this history is joined together. My history, your history, everybody's history in this area is the same, and you can't deny it because it's there. We know that the cabin in which my grandfather was born was on the land owned by a family of slave pen operators who sold thousands of men, women, and children into the economy of the Deep South, many to a premature death. They were still bragging about doing that 20 years later when my grandfather was an adolescent tenant working their family land. My great-grandparents were strangers to none of this, but none of it made its way into the history taught to my generation. Rather, we were told that slavery wasn't all that bad. Seems like I've heard that again recently. That masters took good care of their slaves and that some blacks had been better off as slaves. My simple compilation of family stories grew into a book that I had not intended to write, but that I felt compelled to write. The book traces the history of the land upon which we sit tonight, along with my family history, our community history, and the parallel history of enslaved families. And tonight, we add your church history to that story. One finds in the Second Church archives an exceptional text by Dr. Louis Weeks, History of Second Presbyterian Church, 1830 to 1980. It is a treasure. It relays how a vibrant faith community, your faith community, dealt with the turbulent forces swirling around it. It is unique. Again, it is a treasure, and I will refer to it often. Ours is a rich history, albeit a sometimes unsettling history and a largely untold history. What became known as the religion of the lost cause plays an important and unfortunate role in our shared history. Contemporary historians define the term lost cause as follows: a Southern mythology that champions the moral and legal righteousness of the Confederate States' involvement in the Civil War, attempts to rationalize slavery, minimize the role slavery played as a cause of the war, justify secession, rebuild the pride of the South, cement the idea that blacks are an inferior race, and establish Southern culture as a separate and superior regional identity. You will hear the term lost cause often tonight. Dr. Weeks chronicles the founding of Second Church on April 17, 1830. Then he continues. The next day, the Louisville Daily Advertiser carried a very brief notice of the organization of the church. The biggest domestic issue in Kentucky in the spring of 1830 was the controversy over abolition of slavery. The significance of the turmoil over the institution of slavery in Louisville in 1830 cannot be overstated. By 1830, Kentuckians were expressing a not unreasonable concern over potential slave rebellion. They had read accounts of the post-French Revolution rebellion in Saint Dominique, and rumors abounded of slave rebellions across the South. Slavery was also an issue in the Presbyterian Church. One of the issues that threatened to split the Church General Assembly in 1836. Schism was avoided in 1836 by a compromise resolution which concluded, quote, slavery was recognized in the Bible, and to demand abolition is an unwarranted interference in state laws. One delegate added, who are we to deny communion to slaveholders? Where does it say that in the Bible? The issue raised its head again in the 1837 Presbyterian General Assembly with a less harmonious outcome. The assembly split into what was termed as the old school and new school factions. Relevant to our discussion tonight, adherents to the old school either supported slavery, favored very gradual emancipation, or sought to avoid the issue entirely. Many who adhered to the new school theology generally favored immediate emancipation. Dr. Weeks tells us that there was a general affinity of new school sympathizers within Second Church, but that Pastor E.P. Humphrey, a moderator of the National Presbyterian General Assembly, and, oh, by the way, a co-founder of Cave Hill Cemetery, was unwilling to further divide the church by leaving the old school. If this is accurate, we will see later that there was a marked change in your congregational attitude between 1837 and 1867. When evaluating the 1837 schism, one must be careful not to fixate solely on the issue of slavery. There were significant doctrinal issues dividing the church in addition to the issue of slavery, and these, I believe, relate directly to Dr. Patrick Lewis's presentation 2 weeks ago about pioneer religion in Kentucky. Back in secular society, the nearer we come in time to the Civil War, the more strident the attempts to prevent insurrection. Slave codes were enacted in Kentucky and throughout the South to quell the potential for insurrection. For example, an enslaved person found away from the enslaver's home or farm without a written pass was subject to 10 lashes on his or her back at public whipping posts. The slave codes also authorized public branding and hanging. One provision warned that slaves who give false witness shall have one ear cut off. Another provided that participation in a slave insurrection or encouraging a slave to escape warranted automatic imposition of the death penalty. The slave codes were enforced by slave patrols. Negro hunting, Negro catching, Negro watching, and Negro whipping constituted a favorite sport for many youthful whites serving on the slave patrol. Thus was the rule of law. Now let's return to the rule of God. More context. African communities had not been homogeneous. They had separate governance structures, spoke different languages, and their religious beliefs, while highly spiritual and often similar, were not necessarily the same. This was analogous perhaps to the distinctions among Christian denominations of the day. However, the African peoples had a tradition of reconciling rather than resisting the beliefs of their separate religious communities. In that regard, they were perhaps more tolerant than some of their Christian counterparts. After they arrived in America, the enslaved Africans continued to creatively blend their beliefs and meld those beliefs with the Christianity of their enslavers. That Christianity included justification for the institution of slavery as being ordained by God. Slave Bibles were created, stripped of the book of Exodus. Slaves attended their enslavers' churches under strict physical and dogmatic control. But by night, many slaves attended what became known as secret slave church, presided over by de facto ministers. Slave church was held in the remote sheds, woods, and hollers of rural Kentucky. Starting in the 1840s, in response to a growing abolitionist movement among Northern Protestant congregations, we begin to see a separation of denominations into Northern and Southern structure. In 1857, the New School Presbyterians separated into Northern and Southern conferences. The Old School Presbyterians followed later. The congregation of my mother's Protestant family, St. Paul's German Evangelist Church, did not split into Northern and Southern factions. It had disclaimed the institution of slavery from the church's formation in Louisville in 1836, and as before, for that, it paid a price. The church of my father's German immigrant family, the Roman Catholic Church, accommodated differing views on slavery, but its hierarchy did little to stem beatings, separation of enslaved families, and the sale of slaves into the commerce of the South. All were common, including among the institutions of the Catholic Church itself. Back in the secular front, in Frankfort on December 27, 1860, Stephen Hale, Patriot Kentucky, appointed by the Confederate Congress as its commissioner to Kentucky, delivered a highly incendiary letter to Kentucky Governor Beriah McGoffin. The letter advocated Kentucky's secession in the strongest possible terms. The clear basis upon which the plea was premised was preservation of the institution of slavery. Lincoln's election was said to be nothing less than an open declaration of war. The triumph of this new theory of government would destroy the property of the South and lay waste her fields. It will inaugurate, according to Hale, all the horrors of a San Domingo insurrection, consign her citizens to assassinations and her wives and daughters to pollution and violation to gratify the lust of half-civilized Africans. Secession, he wrote, would provide the only means by which the heaven-ordained superiority of the white over the black race could be maintained. During this period, Southern theologians defended the right of secession based upon formation of the Hebrew Republic set out in chapter 19 of the book of Exodus. Like many institutions in Louisville, prominent members of Second Church supported the Confederacy. Many served as officers in the Confederate Army. None were more ardent supporters of the institution of slavery or more strident critics of the Union Army presence in Louisville than the pastor of Second Church, the Reverend Stuart Robinson. Robinson was born in Ireland, immigrated to Virginia, and studied at Amherst College before attending Union and Princeton theological seminaries. I've read everything I could find on Reverend Robinson. By all accounts, he was a brilliant, gifted, and outspoken clergyman and very sincere in his religious beliefs. Robinson was described by one contemporary as sagacious and evangelical, a bundle of well-disciplined energy who infused new life into Second Church. In 1862, Robinson returned from an old school assembly that had ended with a resolution supporting the Union. Robinson published critical observations of the assembly's action in his journal, The True Presbyterian. Robinson's views expressed in the True Presbyterian were seen as seditious. Rumors of his potential arrest led to his exile in Toronto. There he would remain for 3 years, but he did not remain idle. While in Canada, Robinson preached a clear message of scriptural support for the institution of slavery. He also wrote and published a book entitled Slavery as Recognized in the Mosaic Civil Law. Back in Louisville, initial fealty pledged to the Union faded under the yoke of what was seen as a brutal occupation. Of this period, Dr. Weeks writes, federal troops moved into Louisville in force, setting up a bivouac on land owned by Stuart Robinson. Federal troops treated Louisville generally as an occupied area. Descriptions of Louisville during war years portray pandemonium. Robinson returned to his second church pulpit in early 1865 and immediately wrote a lengthy letter to President Abraham Lincoln, stridently addressing 2 complaints. First, in often disturbingly graphic detail, he set out the atrocities suffered by his family at the hands of the Union Army. Even the most casual student of the Bible is immediately drawn to comparisons with the book of Job. Then, again in great detail, with frequent references to Scripture and to the United States Constitution, Robinson excoriated Kentucky's Union commander for his continued attacks on the true Presbyterian. In 1866, Robinson was arrested and tried before a military court in Washington. He was accused of conspiring with Woodford County physician Dr. Luke Blackburn to infect northern cities with yellow fever. Ultimately, he was acquitted and returned to Louisville, a hero and martyr to many Kentucky Presbyterians. The citizens of Louisville had every justification for being enraged over the treatment they received during the war. For those who supported the institution of slavery and secession, there were other highly personal psychological burdens in play. In her insightful book, The Divided Family in Civil War America, Professor of History Amy Morrell Taylor may hit closest to the mark. Dr. Taylor's research explored a crucial state of mind near the end of the war that affected both the nation and families who sought to be reunited and the faith community to which those individuals belonged. Dr. Taylor writes, for divided families, the past conjured up a range of sentiments from the lamented memory of a dead relative to anger over military defeat, to loneliness and sadness after 4 years of fighting. Families concerned with suppressing these negative feelings and reconnecting on an emotional level found that forgetting, at least in theory, offered a simple solution. A forgotten past was tantamount to a reconciled future and present. Dr. Taylor uncovered correspondence in which family members on both sides of the conflict were urged and cautioned to avoid particular comments about Northern leaders, the causes of the war, and especially slavery. Never mind the Negro now. If slavery could be put aside as the cause of the war, then wounds that had scarred white families in white America could be more quickly healed. The painful divisions became less emotional, less about morality, and more about legal and constitutional issues. As the war ended and one wished to reconcile with a relative, neighbor, or class of citizens, or with oneself, whose commitment to slavery had just created 4 years of death and destruction, what more convenient way than to deny that slavery was the cause of it all? and then heap one's anger upon formerly enslaved persons, persons who were incapable of defending themselves and whose status was seen of no consequence in any event. We see this dynamic at work in both the secular and religious communities. We see it in the post-war writings of Jefferson Davis and in the post-war writings of many members of clergy. On the secular front, the Kentucky legislature became an incubator, reenacting many of the antebellum slave codes into so-called black codes, which evolved into what we now know as Jim Crow laws. 43 Kentucky Jim Crow laws touched every facet of life. They were both comprehensive and chilling. By the end of the 19th century, separation of the races had become an accepted reality. In retrospect, separation of the races overshadowed nearly every aspect of not only Black life, but also of my white family's life, and not for the better. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface. My family lost part of its humanity when it lost the ability to interact on a human level with all of its neighbors. By the 1920s, the shadows of Jim Crow had been cast back across the Atlantic. An aspiring German politician took great interest in Jim Crow and the manner in which Jim Crow was interpreted by American courts. His name was Adolf Hitler, and the Jim Crow laws incubated in Kentucky served as the template for Hitler's 1934 Nuremberg laws of racial suppression. As Jim Crow was dominating our secular community, the myth of the lost cause was dominating our faith community. After the Civil War, in many white churches, Black congregants were no longer welcome. One historian reports that beginning shortly after the war, some white congregants gave up evangelizing the colored people, leaving their soul to the care of Yankees and Black ministers. Black Christians began to form all Black congregations. The great Christian racial diaspora had begun, leading Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to comment nearly a century later that it is appalling that the most segregated hour of Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. In some sectors, traditional Christianity had given way to a new religion, the religion of the lost cause. After the Civil War, Jefferson Davis became the patron saint of the lost cause and its new religion. Davis urged white dominance and control. Davis justified violence to restore what he saw as the appropriate social order in the South. For the remainder of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, the God of the lost cause was characterized as the God of Israel, God of the centuries, God of our forefathers, God of Jefferson Davis and Sidney Johnston, God of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, God of the Southern Confederacy. These are not my words. They are all direct statements of contemporary Southern Christian theology. Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis were deified. Lee's rejection in 1861 of Lincoln's offer of command of the Union Army was compared with Christ's rejection in Matthew chapter 4 of the devil's offer of all the kingdoms of the world. Christ would have been required to bow down and worship Satan. Lee would have been required to bow down and worship Lincoln. Only one true God would be worshiped. In Lee's case, and in the view of the disciples of the lost cause, that one true God was the God of the Confederacy. Likewise, on the night before his surrender, Lee was seen as having suffered the metaphorical anguish of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Later, Lee arose from metaphorical crucifixion to display the gentleness and compassion of the risen Christ. Again, these are not my words. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis, captured, shackled, imprisoned, and presented for execution by a bloodthirsty Yankee mob, also assumed the persona of Christ. He was seen by many in the white church as Christ standing before Pontius Pilate. Some Southern ministers suggested that just as Christians are a chosen people because they had been redeemed by the suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ, Southerners were also a chosen people because they had been redeemed by the suffering of Davis, who had been vilified and deposed, only later to arise metaphorically in moral vindication. Presbyterian pastor James I. Vance, referring to Davis, advanced the metaphor one step further. His enemies could nail Christ to the cross, but they could not quench the ideals he embodied. Jefferson Davis's birthday was celebrated as the Sabbath of the South. It remains to this day a state holiday in Kentucky. Jefferson Davis's writings found their way into Kentucky textbooks and used when my mother and father attended grade school in the 1920s. Reading the history of Second Church during this period alongside secular history of the former slave states and the rise of the religion of the lost cause, the struggles of your vibrant faith community come into focus. Chapter 3 of Dr. Weeks' History of Second Church details many acts of outreach by the Second Church community, outreach to Black congregations and Black families. Second did not abstain from the role of teaching Christian doctrine to Black children and reaching out to assist Black congregations. As a matter of fact, it appears to have embraced those roles. But Second Church was not immune from the religion of the lost cause. Rather, it found itself right in the middle of it. At this point, I need to introduce the Reverend Robert L. Dabney. Reverend Dabney was a Southern Presbyterian minister and scholar. He served several theological seminaries, both as professor and chair of theology, teaching moral philosophy, church history, church government, systematic theology with, quote, a rigorous emphasis on Calvinist orthodoxy. During the war, Dabney served as chaplain, chief of staff, and later biographer of Stonewall Jackson. In 1863, Dabney chaired a committee that brought about the merger of Southern New School and Southern Old School factions to create the Presbyterian Church in the United States, later known in some quarters as the Southern Church. After the war, Dabney became terribly embittered by the South's defeat. Dabney emerged as one of the most influential leaders of the Southern Presbyterian Church. Alongside Reverend Stuart Robinson, Reverend Dabney played a key role in the Second Church decision to affiliate with the Southern Presbyterian Church. At chapter 3 of Dr. Weeks' Second Church History, Second's arduous transition from the Old School Assembly in 1865 to the Southern Church in 1869 is set out in detail. After Second joined the Southern Church, they purchased land at the corner of Second and Broadway and began construction of new church buildings. No sooner was the church lecture hall completed than the entire Southern Presbyterian Assembly descended upon Louisville and Second Church for the General Assembly of 1870. Dabney read and Robinson preached that day's opening scripture lesson, Romans chapter 1, verses 14 to 16, an interesting selection under the circumstances. The power of God brings salvation to everyone who believes. Thereafter, as its first order of business, the General Assembly elected Dabney as its moderator. During the assembly, an unexpected trio of distinguished visitors arrived. The pastors of the First Presbyterian churches of Brooklyn and Baltimore, and a wealthy Presbyterian philanthropist named W.C. Dodge, the progenitor of the automobiles, known in the North as the Prince of Wall Street. They arrived bearing a resolution from the Northern Church proposing a joint committee to open friendly correspondence between Northern and Southern Presbyterian assemblies. Reverend Dabney and Reverend Robinson are said to have reacted negatively to the overture. They would have none of it. The assembly demurred, suggesting that the two bodies remain at a friendly distance. In Dr. Weeks's words, presumably the wounds of the schism and the memory of the war affected sentiments of the Southern Church too deeply for most to move toward healing the division at that time. John B. Bowles, endowed professor of history at Rice University, writes that while serving as moderator of the denomination General Assembly here in Louisville, Dabney helped scuttle efforts to promote fraternal relations between Southern and Northern Presbyterians, and he vehemently opposed any efforts toward reunification. Religious commentator Daniel Clevin suggests that Dabney, quote, turned the tide against racial equality in the Southern Presbyterian Church for the next 100 years. But your faith community at Second Church proves that suggestion to be a significant overstatement. I would be remiss if I did not mention what may have been the most significant event in our community's religious and racial history, the merger of Northern and Southern seminaries and the founding of the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. It is very clear from chapter 4 of Dr. Weeks's History of Second Church that the merger of the Northern and Southern seminaries would not have happened but for the leadership, time, talent, and donated facilities of your faith community. Your pastor, Dr. George Hempel, appears to have been one of the driving forces behind that merger. In my view, there has been no greater single event over the course of more than 2 centuries of Louisville history, no single event more influential in dispelling the myth of the lost cause and all that came with it and all that came before it than the merger of the Presbyterian seminaries. It is not properly understood by the secular community, and it is consistently overlooked in our community history, but it is there, it is real. It was a single act of Christian love and understanding. It is a significant part of your faith community's heritage, and in it, you should take great pride. In closing, some will ask, why dig into all this now? Why include the discomfort of our Black history as part of church history or American history? On that subject, I am persuaded by the words of Dr. Jamar Tisby, author, historian, and professor of history at Simmons University. To that question, Dr. Tisby would respond, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us and are unconsciously controlled by it. History is literally present in all that we do. We can hear cadences and syncopations from the past in the present. Learning about history is more than learning about what has happened before. It is about understanding what is happening now. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to receive your comments and respond to your questions as best I can.
questions?
I have a question.
All right.
I've heard of Stuart Robinson, but I've never heard of Reverend Dabney. How long was he a minister in our church? Do you know?
He was not a minister here. He was the apostle of a lot of colleges in the Presbyterian Church across the South. He probably traveled a lot, don't you think, David?
Thank you, David. You know what was the year? It was after I moved here and married from Jersey. That the northern and southern churches came reconciled. It was not that long ago. Do you remember what year?
1988.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, what was the year when the northern and southern churches reconciled and became the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, PCUSA? And the answer was 1988. There's one other thing that I should point out. In Kentucky, it happened sooner than that. My church in Hopkinsville, this church became participating members in both the Southern and the Northern Church. And this happened early in the pastorate of Glenn Doris, who was here for 20 years from 1968 to 1988. There'll be more about Glenn as we go forward, but he will emerge, I think, historically as one of this church's most significant pastors.
And Glenn had a son named Bill, that some of you may remember. And he moved to Atlanta, went to law school, and became one of the most outstanding construction lawyers in the United States. And I was involved in several pieces of litigation with Bill, and he probably preached just like his daddy. And
More questions for David? Well, let me also say that John?
How did your great-grandparents end up in Kentucky from Germany?
well, I believe they came through New York, but I'm not sure about that. That's a little bit of a mystery. Kentucky was on the southern leg of something called the German Triangle. And that was comprised of Milwaukee in the north, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. So there was a huge German population here. And I'm sure you've read of the Bloody Monday in 1854, 1855, when a number of German and Irish citizens were murdered going to the polls. It was a very bitter relationship. It's not unlike some of the things we're seeing now, but there was out and out violence, and it all stemmed from the vote. And there was a theory that Henry Clay lost the election of 1844, was that his last run, because at the last minute, the vote came in from New York, and it swung New York, and that swung the presidency. And the theory was that German immigrants had been made citizens as soon as they got off the boat and told to vote for the Democrat. So that gave rise to the know-nothings and lots of other mischief.
How did you get interested in your family history?
When my mother had an interesting family. My mother had 3 sisters who never married and who lived together their whole life, and another sister who married but had no children. And there were 5 grandchildren, and we all had 5 mothers, our birth mother and our aunt. And they were wonderful. They were absolutely wonderful. And when the last aunt died in 2011, I was overcome by grief. I was absolutely overcome by grief. And the only way I could deal with it was to write down all these stories. And there are lots and lots and lots of stories. There's a story about the preacher and the chicken, and the story about the snakes in the barn, and on and on and on. But then I dug down into it with the help of the Oldham County Historical Society. And I said, wait a minute, you know. And the first land that they owned in Kentucky was where what was formerly known as the Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church is on Old Brownsboro Road. Well, there's still an old structure behind their sanctuary that was my great-grandparents' first home of their own. And I looked at the deed, and the deed was signed by somebody named Zachary L. Taylor. Well, Zachary L. Taylor was the great nephew of President Taylor, but the son of someone, oh gosh, what was his nickname? Of a nephew of General Taylor, who, where is Jill? His name, Jill, remember? Walker Taylor. Walker Taylor was the most audacious spy in the Confederate Army. And he, among other things, participated in a plot to kidnap Lincoln. It had all set to kidnap Lincoln on the way from the White House to the summer home he had. And Jefferson Davis nixed it because he thought Lincoln, being a frontiersman, would not give up easily and might get killed in the process, and they'd never get a negotiated peace. But I'm rambling now. But anyway, that's just, my grandfather learned his Civil War history sitting at the knee of Walker Taylor and hearing all of these, you know, stories of valor and heroism. So anyway, I'm rambling now. But that's
So what did you do with what you wrote?
I gave it to the best editor in the United States to help me with, and the best publisher. Okay.
One of the things that you may or may not want to comment on that I think about when I hear these stories, and I was thinking again during your presentation that our parents and our grandparents and our that lived through that time, when you look at it in retrospect and you think that they were living in that culture, and we sit today and rightfully so are appalled at all of what was happening. But those people, what I've still struggled with is how do I reconcile my ancestry today with the times in which they lived? Because the same people that acceded to that were also the people that taught us the faith, that brought us to Sunday school, that taught us the manners and how to. I can remember like at 10 years old in another church, almost where I was sitting, that on that day all of the black people were going to march from the white churches. So all of our ushers were in the vestibule. Keeps the people out. Some of them had bats in the church. And I can remember truly being scared, looking back like, well, is anybody going to break in? So as I hear the history, which I think is just fascinating, I still struggle with how do I reconcile that with what we believe, what I believe now was clearly wrong, with those people that also taught us good things. I don't know, from a historian, if you want to comment on that.
I do want to comment. That's a lot to unpack. First of all, kind of an interesting thing. I was raised. My religious formation was in my father's church, Catholic church, and there was one Catholic family in that church, and their children did not go to our grade school. It was all white at our grade school. And when that family would come to Mass on Sunday, they would all sit in the back pew, and they would come to communion last after all the white people had done communion. And this would have been in the 1950s. Okay. On far as the rest of it, you know, I talked about this in that because I remember my mother telling me, you know, some black people were better off this way. There was no problem. You know, they were taken care of. And how do I reconcile that with my mother? Well, my mother heard that from her mother, and her mother heard that from my great-grandmother, who, along with my great-grandfather, was scared to death. Okay, and I read it. I made this longer than I intended by reading all the etiquette that the black people were supposed to follow. I believe that I know there was, because I could remember my father said when they integrated the restaurants downtown. You know, I mean, my family was not a wealthy family. I can remember my father saying, what are they doing going to thus and so restaurant? Well, we can't even go there. Okay, so I think somehow 3 generations back, these rules of conduct were incorporated into our family out of fear and survival. I can't address the concept of slave ownership because I just can't address it because it's not in my heritage and anything, but I can address the fear that because I felt that fear as a child. I felt that fear. And I felt also a fear of Black people.
In 2 weeks, I'll be talking about the history of Second as it enters the Gilded Age. But I will pick up with the Reverend Stuart Robinson. And there are ways that how do I put this? For me, slight family history. My family enslaved human beings from 1619 to 1865. That's 7 generations. In Virginia, and then here in Kentucky and in Henderson. My great-grandfather and his brothers and sisters, there were 6 of them, they divided their father's enslaved people in a legal instrument that's on file in the Henderson County Courthouse, and each of them took some. Because their father died young and without a will. And it's a horrifying instrument to read because, you know, different children are taking different slaves and their children. That exercise that I live with makes me look back historically at figures like Reverend Robinson with a less judgmental eye. Because, you know, for me, I have to say, what would I have been like in that age? That, Ronnie, goes to your comment. Who am I to judge? In the narthex is a stained glass window, and Reverend Robinson's picture is in it. In the parlor is a copy of a portrait of Reverend Robinson. He played a 20-year significant role in the history of this church. And while now I can read the letters to Lincoln, I can read the anger that comes out in a lot of his writing. I also see when he gets off slavery and onto other things, straight, you know, where he's doing biblical interpretation on other things, I can think, man, this man was a gifted writer, a very skilled advocate or minister, and historically an interesting figure. And in the history of Louisville, Kentucky, he was a major player in his day. He owned all of what is now Central Park. The house that he built still stands. It's a magnificent stone structure. He counseled his congregants, many of whom were people of enormous power and influence, and led them with I think missionary zeal in many different causes and directions. So there is this, once you start reading about it and learning about it, he emerges as a vastly more complex figure. Does that mean that you know, anyone who was a slaveholder back then can or should be completely absolved and forgiven? Not for me, because the debates were clear. People knew what the consequences were. They understood the horrors of enslavement in the state. The first great Kentucky minister was the Reverend David Rice, who came over in pioneer times, is buried at First Presbyterian Church in Danville, right beside Center. But what he did was argue strongly for total abolition back then. So it is a complicated, difficult, tricky series of questions. And it's part of what being American is all about.
One thing to add to that, I did a paper on Henry Clay, which I had a number of people, including college professors, tell me not to write because it was too controversial. A former, because he is too controversial, a former chair of the history department at U of L said, no, you can't look at anybody in the past through today's lens. You have to look at it through the lens of when they were living. And then he told me, he said, 100 years from now, we may all be considered absolutely horrible for driving gasoline.
Caesar, when I start, you'll look at the church over there on the left. That is not the church that Reverend Robinson built. He built one like it, but it burned down. So not only did that church burn in 1957, the one that Robinson built after the war in the 1870s or 80s, it burned in the early 1900s. But more about that later. David, you were wonderful. Thank you.